Jake Morrison pulled his worn baseball cap lower over his eyes as he counted the crumpled bills in his wallet for the third time that morning. $18.43. That was all that stood between him and losing his family's ranch forever. The bank notice crumpled in his back pocket felt like a death sentence. 30 days to pay $43,000 or watch bulldozers tear down everything his grandfather had built. The dusty town of Cedar Creek had seen better days. Like Jake, at 28, his hands were already weathered from years of ranch work. His boots held together with duct tape and his pride worn thin from watching neighbors lose their land one by one. The drought had lasted 3 years, cattle prices had plummeted, and medical bills from his father's cancer treatment had drained every last savings account. Jake sat on the courthouse steps, staring at the foreclosure notice when an elegant black sedan pulled up to the curb. The car looked completely out of place in their small Texas town, like a diamond in a bucket of coal. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a woman who commanded attention without trying. Margaret Whitmore was 70 years old, but she moved with the grace of someone half her age. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her clothes spoke of wealth and sophistication, and her piercing blue eyes seemed to see right through people's facades. She had inherited the Whitmore fortune when her husband died 15 years earlier, making her one of the richest women in Texas. Their eyes met across the courthouse lawn, and something unexpected happened. Margaret saw not a desperate young man, but someone fighting to preserve family legacy. Jake saw not just another wealthy outsider, but a woman who understood the weight of carrying on family traditions. They struck up a conversation that lasted 3 hours. Margaret had been married twice before, first to her college sweetheart who died in Vietnam, then to oil tycoon Robert Whitmore, who gave her everything money could buy except genuine companionship. She had no children, no close relatives, and had spent 15 years surrounded by people who wanted her money, but not her heart. When Margaret learned about Jake's situation, she made an offer that shocked everyone in town. She would pay off his debts and save the ranch, but only if he agreed to marry her. Not for love, she explained, but for companionship and mutual benefit. She was tired of being alone, and he needed financial security. The proposal caused a storm of gossip throughout Cedar Creek. People whispered about gold digging and questioned Margaret's mental state. Jake's friends thought he had lost his mind. His mother worried about his happiness. But as Jake spent more time with Margaret over the following weeks, he discovered she was intelligent, funny, and genuinely kind. Margaret never talked down to him or made him feel like charity case. She listened to his dreams of modernizing the ranch, expanding the cattle operation, and maybe even starting a horse breeding program. She shared stories of her travels around the world, her passion for art collecting, and her quiet philanthropy work. The wedding was simple, held in the town's small church with only a handful of witnesses. Margaret wore an elegant cream-colored dress. Jake wore his father's old suit that had been altered to fit. The preacher seemed nervous, stumbling over words as he pronounced them husband and wife. Some attendees whispered and shook their heads, but Jake and Margaret ignored them. Their first week of marriage was surprisingly comfortable. Margaret moved into the ranch house, bringing only a few personal belongings and leaving her mansion in Dallas. She adapted to country life better than anyone expected, helping with breakfast, learning about cattle care, and even trying her hand at horseback riding. Jake found himself looking forward to their evening conversations on the front porch. Margaret had traveled extensively and lived through decades of history that fascinated him. She had met presidents, attended exclusive parties, and witnessed the civil rights movement firsthand. Her stories made his world feel bigger and more connected. The ranch began transforming almost immediately. Margaret hired contractors to fix the leaking roof, update the electrical system, and repair damaged fencing. She purchased new cattle, upgraded equipment, and even bought Jake a new truck to replace his 15-year-old pickup that barely ran. But Margaret was careful not to make Jake feel like an employee on his own land. Every major decision was discussed between them. She asked for his expertise on livestock purchases and land management. She deferred to his knowledge about local suppliers and weather patterns. The partnership felt genuine rather than patronizing. Local attitudes slowly began shifting as people saw Margaret working alongside Jake, attending church services and shopping at the same stores as everyone else. She donated generously to the town's library renovation project and sponsored the high school's rodeo team. Children who had been initially wary started waving when she drove by. Jake's mother, initially skeptical about the arrangement, found herself genuinely liking Margaret. The two women bonded over family recipes and stories about Jake's childhood. Margaret seemed hungry for family connections she had never experienced, while Jake's mother appreciated having another woman around who understood the challenges of ranch life. As their 10th day of marriage approached, Jake realized he was happier than he had been in years. The constant stress of financial worry had lifted. The ranch was thriving again. He had a partner who respected his knowledge and shared his vision for the future. Maybe their unusual arrangement could actually work, but Margaret had been unusually quiet the past 2 days, often staring out windows with a troubled expression. She had received several phone calls that she took privately, speaking in hushed tones before hanging up quickly when Jake appeared. Her confident demeanor seemed to crack slightly, revealing worry lines around her eyes. Jake noticed she had been organizing her personal papers, updating documents, and making what seemed like important phone calls to lawyers and financial advisors. When he asked if everything was all right, Margaret smiled and assured him it was just routine business matters. But her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and Jake sensed something significant was troubling his new wife. The morning of their 10th day as husband and wife started like any other, with Margaret making coffee while Jake tended to the horses. But when he returned to the house, he found her sitting at the kitchen table with tears streaming down her face, holding a manila envelope that had arrived with the morning mail. Jake had never seen Margaret cry before. Throughout their courtship and marriage, she had maintained an air of composed strength that seemed unshakable. Seeing her vulnerable and frightened sent alarm bells ringing in his head. He sat down beside her, unsure whether he should offer comfort or give her space. Margaret looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes and spoke words that changed everything between them. She told him she was dying. The envelope contained test results from her doctor in Dallas, confirming what she had. Suspected for weeks, pancreatic cancer, stage 4, with maybe 3 months to live if she was lucky. The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. Felt stupid and used, realizing that Margaret had married him knowing she would die soon and leave him everything. The romantic notion that they were building a genuine partnership crumbled as he understood the real timeline of their relationship. She had basically bought herself a companion for her final months. Margaret explained that she had been experiencing symptoms for months, but had been too scared to see a doctor until after their wedding. She had hoped it might be something treatable, something that wouldn't interfere with their new life together. The tears came harder as she admitted she had been selfish, trapping him in a marriage with a dying woman without giving him a choice. Jake's initial anger surprised him with its intensity. He felt deceived and manipulated, like everyone in town had been right about Margaret using him. She was just another wealthy person who thought money could solve any problem, including loneliness. In the face of death, he stormed out of the house and spent the morning riding his horse through the back pastures, trying to process what this meant for his future. But as the day wore on, Jake found his anger shifting toward something more complex. He remembered Margaret's genuine laughter during their evening conversations, the way she had respected his knowledge about ranching and how she had integrated herself into his community. Her tears that morning hadn't seemed manipulative. They had seemed like those of a frightened woman who had found something worth living for just as death came knocking. When Jake returned to the house that evening, Margaret was packing her belongings. She had called her lawyer and was making arrangements to dissolve their marriage immediately. She planned to return to Dallas for treatment and leave him with enough money to keep the ranch running. She wouldn't trap him in a marriage to a dying woman, and she was sorry for being selfish. Jake surprised himself by asking her to stop packing. Over the next several hours, they had the most honest conversation of their relationship. Margaret explained that meeting him had given her something. She thought she would never have a sense of belonging somewhere and being valued for herself rather than her money. The ranch felt like home in a way her mansion never had. Jake admitted that despite feeling deceived, he had grown genuinely fond of Margaret. She had brought not just financial stability, but intellectual stimulation and emotional warmth to his life. Their partnership felt real, even if it was built on an incomplete foundation. He didn't want to abandon her to face death alone in some sterile medical facility. They agreed to continue their marriage with complete honesty going forward. Margaret would get the best medical treatment available, but she would remain at the ranch for as long as possible. Jake would support her through whatever came next. Not as a hired companion, but as someone who cared about her well-being. The next few weeks brought a whirlwind of medical appointments, second opinions, and treatment discussions. Margaret's oncologist in Dallas was pessimistic about treatment options given the advanced stage of her cancer. But they developed a plan focused on quality of life rather than aggressive intervention that would likely prove futile. Jake found himself learning about chemotherapy schedules, pain management techniques, and dietary restrictions for cancer patients. Margaret was determined to maintain as much normalcy as possible, insisting on continuing her ranch work when she felt strong enough and participating in community activities that brought her joy. The town's reaction to Margaret's diagnosis was unexpectedly supportive. Women from the church organized meal deliveries and offered to help with household tasks. The local doctor coordinated with Margaret's specialists to provide care closer to home when possible. Even people who had initially criticized the marriage stepped forward with gestures of kindness. Jake's mother became Margaret's closest confidant during this period, sharing stories about her husband's cancer battle and providing practical advice about managing symptoms and treatments. The two women spent hours together, quilting and talking about everything except the elephant in the room that Margaret probably wouldn't live to see the next spring. Margaret used her remaining energy to help Jake develop long-term plans for the ranch that would ensure its sustainability after she was gone. They worked with agricultural experts to diversify the operation, invested in renewable energy systems that would reduce operating costs, and established relationships with premium beef buyers who would provide steady income streams. But beyond the practical preparations, Margaret was determined to create memories and experiences that would outlast her physical presence. She convinced Jake to take weekend trips to places he had never seen, art museums in Fort Worth, historical sites around Texas, and even a brief vacation to Colorado, where they rode horses through mountain trails that took Jake's breath away. During these travels, Jake began to understand what Margaret had meant about feeling lonely despite being surrounded by people. She had spent years attending social events and charity functions where everyone wanted something from her. At the ranch, people accepted her for who she was rather than what she could provide financially, as Margaret's health began declining. More noticeably, Jake found himself becoming her primary caregiver. He learned to monitor her medication schedules, help her when walking became difficult, and provide comfort during the bad days when pain made normal activities impossible. The intimacy of caregiving created a bond between them that went deeper than their original arrangement. Margaret confided that marrying Jake had been the best decision of her life. Even though the timing was cruel, she had experienced more genuine happiness in 2 months of ranch life than in decades of wealth and social status. Jake realized that despite the deception, he wouldn't trade their time together for anything. Margaret had changed his perspective on life, showing him possibilities beyond just surviving from one season to the next. 3 months after Margaret's diagnosis, Jake noticed she was having increasingly difficult days where even simple tasks, like buttoning her shirt or walking to the kitchen, became monumental challenges. The cancer was progressing faster than her doctors had predicted, but Margaret refused to give in to despair or self-pity. Instead, she seemed determined to pack a lifetime of experiences into whatever time remained. Margaret began what she called her legacy project, documenting everything she wanted Jake to know about managing her business interests and philanthropic commitments after she was gone. But more importantly, she started recording video messages for special occasions she would miss. Birthday wishes for Jake's future birthdays, anniversary messages for years they wouldn't share, and even encouragement for challenges he might face decades later. Jake initially resisted participating in these recordings, finding them too painful to contemplate. But Margaret convinced him that she wanted to remain part of his life even after death, offering guidance and support the way a loving spouse would. The videos became their evening ritual, with Margaret sharing wisdom about everything from investment strategies to relationship advice for when Jake eventually found love again. The ranch had become a gathering place for Margaret's makeshift family. Jake's mother visited daily, often staying to help with cooking and household tasks. Neighbors dropped by regularly, ostensibly to check on cattle or discuss ranch business, but really to spend time with Margaret, whose warmth and intelligence had won over even the most skeptical townspeople. Margaret's lawyer, David Chen, became a frequent visitor as well, helping update estate plans and ensure Jake would have legal protection when inheriting such a substantial fortune. David was initially surprised by the genuine affection he witnessed between Jake and Margaret. Having expected to find a gold digger taking advantage of a lonely widow, instead he found a couple who had created something real despite unusual circumstances. One evening, Margaret asked Jake to drive her to the town cemetery where his grandparents were buried. She wanted to pay her respects to the people who had built the land that had brought them together. As they stood among the weathered headstones, Margaret talked about death without fear, explaining that she felt peaceful knowing Jake would continue the ranch's legacy and maintain connections to the community they had built together. Jake found Margaret's acceptance of mortality both inspiring and heartbreaking. She faced each day with curiosity about what new experience it might bring, rather than dwelling on what she was losing. When pain prevented her from riding horses, she learned to appreciate watching them from the porch. When walking became difficult, she discovered joy in hand-feeding chickens from a chair in the yard. Margaret's appetite began failing in the 4th month. Jake learned to prepare small portions of foods that were easy to digest. She lost weight rapidly, but her spirit remained strong. She continued reading voraciously, often sharing interesting passages with Jake over breakfast. She maintained correspondence with friends around the world, never mentioning her illness, but focusing on current events and shared interests. The local doctor, Dr. Sarah Martinez, had become deeply involved in Margaret's care, making house calls and coordinating with specialists to manage pain and symptoms. Dr. Martinez was amazed by Margaret's positive attitude and the strong support system she had built in such a short time. Many patients with similar diagnoses became bitter or withdrawn, but Margaret seemed to bloom with gratitude for every day. Jake struggled with watching someone he had grown to love face death with such grace. He found himself angry at the unfairness of losing Margaret just as he was learning what it meant to have a true partner. But Margaret helped him understand that their relationship was valuable precisely because it was temporary and precious, not despite those factors. Margaret's former socialite friends from Dallas began visiting the ranch, initially out of curiosity about her unusual living situation. Many expected to find her diminished by rural life and illness, but instead discovered a woman who seemed more vibrant and authentic than she had ever been in their wealthy circles. Several commented privately to Jake that they had never seen Margaret so genuinely happy. During these visits, Jake learned more about Margaret's previous life and began understanding why their simple ranch existence had meant so much to her. She had spent decades attending events where every conversation was calculated. Every relationship was transactional, and every interaction was performed rather than genuine. At the ranch, people valued her for her contributions to community life rather than her ability to write checks. Margaret's strength began declining more noticeably in month 5, but she remained determined to participate in ranch life as much as possible. Jake modified their daily routines to accommodate her limitations while preserving her sense of independence and dignity. He installed grab bars in strategic locations, arranged furniture to minimize walking distances, and hired a part-time nurse to assist with medical needs. The nurse, Alina Rodriguez, was a retired hospice worker who had moved to Cedar Creek to be closer to her grandchildren. Alina brought decades of experience helping families navigate terminal illness with grace and dignity. She taught Jake practical caregiving skills while providing emotional support for both him and Margaret during the most difficult days. Margaret used her stronger days to complete projects that mattered to her. She finished a quilt she had been making with Jake's mother, featuring patterns that told the story of their family ranch. She wrote personal letters to everyone who had shown kindness during her illness, expressing gratitude for their friendship and support. She organized her art collection, deciding which pieces would go to local museums and which would remain at the ranch. Jake found himself treasuring their quiet moments together, watching sunsets from the porch, listening to Margaret's stories about her travels and sharing dreams about ranch improvements they would never complete together. These conversations revealed depths of Margaret's character he was still discovering. She had hidden remarkable intelligence and creativity behind her socialite facade for decades. As winter approached, Margaret's doctors suggested she might want to consider moving to a hospice facility for more intensive care. Margaret refused, explaining that the ranch had become her true home, and she wanted to spend her final weeks surrounded by the life she and Jake had built together. Jake supported her decision completely, knowing that removing Margaret from the environment where she had flourished would diminish her remaining time. Margaret's final weeks brought an unexpected peace to the ranch that surprised everyone involved in her care. Instead of the fear and sadness Jake had expected, there was a sense of completion and gratitude that seemed to emanate from Margaret herself. She had stopped trying to fight the cancer and instead focused on savoring each remaining day with the people who had become her chosen family. Jake had learned to read Margaret's needs without her having to ask for help. He could tell by her breathing patterns when pain was increasing, knew which foods she might be able to tolerate on difficult days, and understood when she needed quiet solitude versus companionship. Their communication had deepened beyond words, to something more intuitive and caring. Margaret spent her stronger moments working on what she called her love letters to the future. These weren't just practical documents about inheritance and business matters, but personal messages for Jake, about building a life after grief, finding love again when he was ready, and maintaining the values they had discovered together. She wrote about everything from holiday traditions she hoped he would continue to advice about choosing a life partner, would appreciate the ranch's unique magic. The community's response to Margaret's approaching death revealed how thoroughly she had integrated into their small town's fabric. The church organized prayer circles that included people from different denominations. Local businesses offered to help maintain the ranch during Margaret's final days and Jake's period of grieving afterward. Children drew pictures and wrote letters expressing hope that Margaret would feel better soon. Alina, the hospice nurse, had never worked with a patient who faced death with such equanimity. Margaret seemed genuinely curious about the dying process, asking thoughtful questions about what to expect and how to make the experience as peaceful as possible for everyone involved. She talked about death as another life transition, like moving to a new city or starting a different job. Margaret's appetite disappeared almost entirely during her final month, but she continued enjoying small sips of coffee and occasional tastes of homemade soup that Jake's mother prepared daily. Eating became less about nutrition and more about sharing moments of normalcy and comfort. Margaret joked that she had finally found the perfect diet plan. Though her sense of humor about her condition sometimes worried Jake, Dr. Martinez increased the frequency of her visits, amazed by Margaret's mental clarity and emotional stability, even as her physical condition deteriorated rapidly. Margaret remained interested in current events, asked thoughtful questions about other patients' welfare, continued making jokes that kept everyone's spirits higher than seemed possible under the circumstances. Jake found himself learning life lessons during these final weeks that he never could have anticipated. Margaret taught him that grief and gratitude could coexist, that love didn't require decades to develop deep roots. Then that saying goodbye properly was one of the most important skills anyone could learn. She showed him that dignity wasn't about avoiding vulnerability, but about facing it with honesty and grace. Margaret's former business associates continued calling with questions about investments and philanthropic projects, but she had trained Jake to handle most routine decisions. She was proud that he had developed confidence in managing financial matters that once seemed impossibly complex. Jake discovered he had better instincts for business than he had ever realized, and Margaret assured him he would be fine managing her estate. On what turned out to be Margaret's last coherent day, she asked Jake to help her outside to sit in the garden they had planted together behind the house. The late autumn air was crisp, and most of the flowers had finished blooming, but Margaret seemed to find peace in the cycle of seasonal change. We talked about how gardens taught people about death and renewal, loss and growth, endings and new beginnings. Margaret thanked Jake for giving her the happiest months of her life, explaining that their marriage had shown her what genuine partnership looked like. She had experienced wealth, social status, and luxury, but had never known what it felt like to be valued for her authentic self, rather than her external circumstances. The ranch had given her a sense of belonging she had never found anywhere else. Jake struggled to express his own gratitude for what Margaret had brought to his life. Beyond saving the ranch financially, she had expanded his understanding of what was possible. She had shown him books, music, art, and ideas that had enriched his perspective on everything. She had demonstrated that intelligence and kindness were more valuable than any material possessions. That evening, Margaret slipped into a peaceful sleep from which she never woke up. Jake sat beside her bed, holding her hand and listening to her breathing become increasingly shallow until it stopped entirely just before dawn. Alina had prepared him for this moment, but the actual experience of watching someone die peacefully was both more difficult and more beautiful than he had expected. Margaret's death was as graceful as her life had been during their brief time together. There was no struggle, no apparent pain, just a gradual transition from presence to absence that seemed natural rather than tragic. Jake found himself feeling grateful that Margaret had been able to die at home, surrounded by love, in the place where she had been happiest. The funeral arrangements Margaret had planned reflected her practical nature and deep appreciation for the community that had embraced her. She had requested a simple service at the local church, followed by burial in the town cemetery, where she would rest near Jake's grandparents. She had also planned a celebration of life gathering at the ranch, with food and music that would help people remember joy rather than focusing only on loss. Jake was amazed by how many people attended Margaret's funeral services. Friends from Dallas, mixed with local ranchers, creating conversations between worlds that rarely intersected. Everyone shared stories about Margaret's kindness, intelligence, and humor that revealed different facets of her personality. Jake realized he had been married to someone even more remarkable than he had understood. Margaret's lawyer, David Chen, handled the estate transition with sensitivity to Jake's emotional state while ensuring all legal requirements were met properly. The inheritance process was complicated by the substantial assets involved, but Margaret's meticulous planning made everything as straightforward as possible. Jake found himself inheriting not just money and property, but also responsibilities to continue Margaret's philanthropic work and maintain business relationships she had valued. As Jake returned to the empty ranch house after Margaret's funeral, he felt simultaneously grateful for their time together and overwhelmed by the prospect of building a life without her guidance and companionship. The house felt different without Margaret's presence, but it also felt like a place where love had lived even briefly and where her influence would continue shaping his decisions for years to come. 6 months after Margaret's death, Jake was still adjusting to the strange reality of being a wealthy widower at 30 years old. The ranch had been transformed from a struggling family operation into one of the most successful agricultural businesses in the region, but success felt hollow without Margaret there to share in the achievements they had planned together. Jake threw himself into expanding the ranch operations, using Margaret's business acumen and his own agricultural knowledge to develop innovative programs that attracted attention from universities and agricultural organizations. He established a scholarship fund in Margaret's name for rural students pursuing higher education, remembering how she had valued learning and intellectual curiosity. Above material possessions, the community's perception of Jake had evolved dramatically. Since Margaret's death, initially some people had expected him to sell the ranch and move to Dallas to enjoy his inheritance among wealthy social circles. Instead, Jake remained committed to rural life and used his new resources to benefit the entire region. He hired local workers, supported community projects, and maintained the down-earth personality that it attracted. Margaret initially. Jake's mother had been his emotional anchor during the grief process, helping him understand that missing Margaret was natural and healthy rather than something to overcome quickly. She often found Jake reading books Margaret had recommended or listening to music she had introduced him to, maintaining connections to her influence even after death. His mother understood that Jake wasn't dwelling in the past, but carrying forward the best aspects of his relationship with Margaret Alina. The hospice nurse had remained in contact with Jake, checking on his emotional well-being and offering guidance about processing grief. She had worked with many widows and widowers over the years and recognized that Jake was handling his loss in healthy ways. He allowed himself to feel sadness without becoming consumed by it, and he honored Margaret's memory through actions rather than just words. Jake began receiving social invitations from wealthy families in Dallas and Houston who were curious about the young rancher who had inherited the Whitmore fortune. These events felt artificial and uncomfortable compared to the genuine community connections he valued at home. Jake attended a few gatherings out of obligation to Margaret's memory, but he realized he preferred the authentic relationships he had built in Cedar Creek. Margaret's video messages had become an important part of Jake's healing process. Every few weeks, he would watch recordings she had made for specific situations dealing with business challenges, making major decisions, or simply feeling lonely. Her voice offered comfort and practical advice that helped him navigate unfamiliar territory as a wealthy individual with significant responsibilities. Jake discovered that managing Margaret's philanthropic commitments was more complex and rewarding than he had expected. She had supported dozens of organizations focused on education, healthcare, and rural development, but she had been strategic rather than simply writing checks. Jake learned to evaluate programs based on their effectiveness and long-term impact, developing skills in nonprofit management that complemented his agricultural expertise. One of Margaret's charitable projects had been supporting a program that brought city children to working ranches for educational experiences. Jake decided to expand this initiative, creating a summer camp program that taught urban youth about agriculture, environmental stewardship, and rural life. The project allowed him to share knowledge while honoring Margaret's belief in education. As a tool for breaking down social barriers, Jake's dating life became a source of speculation and unwanted attention from people who were more interested in his financial status than his personal qualities. Several women from wealthy families made obvious attempts to attract his interest, yet their motivations reminded him uncomfortably of the gold digger accusations that had followed his marriage to Margaret. He began to understand why Margaret had been so lonely despite being surrounded by potential suitors. Dr. Martinez, who had cared for Margaret during her final months, became someone Jake trusted for advice about personal matters. She had observed his devotion to Margaret and understood that he was grieving the loss of a genuine partnership rather than just financial security. Dr. Martinez encouraged Jake to take time processing his grief before considering new relationships. But she also reminded him that Margaret would want him to find love again when he was ready. Jake began traveling to places Margaret had wanted to show him, but hadn't had time to visit before her health declined. He went to art museums she had recommended, attended cultural events she had enjoyed, and visited historical sites she had found fascinating. These trips helped him feel connected to Margaret's interests while expanding his own horizons beyond ranch life. The ranch itself had become a memorial to Margaret in subtle ways that reflected her influence without turning it. Jake maintained the garden they had planted together, continued traditions like evening conversations on the porch, and kept books she had loved in prominent places throughout the house. The ranch felt like a place where Margaret's spirit remained, present through the positive changes she had initiated. Jake's relationship with Margaret's former friends in Dallas had evolved into something deeper than he had expected. Several of these women had been genuinely fond of Margaret and appreciated how Jake had made her final months happy. They included him in social events not because of his wealth, but because he represented a connection to their departed friend. One of these friendships was with Catherine Williams, a widow in her 50s who had known Margaret since childhood. Catherine had been impressed by Jake's devotion to Margaret during her illness and his commitment to continuing her charitable work after death. Unlike other wealthy people who seemed interested in Jake's inheritance, Catherine valued his character and integrity. Jake found himself able to discuss Margaret with Catherine in ways that weren't possible with other people. Catherine had known Margaret before her marriage to Robert Whitmore. Understanding the loneliness and social isolation that had made her final months at the ranch so meaningful, these conversations helped Jake process his grief while gaining deeper insight into the woman he had married. As Jake approached the first anniversary of Margaret's death, he realized he had successfully integrated her influence into his ongoing life without becoming trapped by grief or guilt. The ranch was thriving, his community relationships were stronger than ever, and he had developed confidence in managing business and philanthropic responsibilities that once seemed overwhelming. Margaret's legacy was alive in practical ways that would continue benefiting others for decades. 2 years after Margaret's death, Jake had settled into a life that balanced honoring her memory with building his own future. The anniversary of their wedding had become a day of celebration rather than mourning, when Jake would invite community members to the ranch for a gathering that reflected Margaret's love of bringing people together. These events had evolved into an annual tradition that strengthened bonds between neighbors and celebrated the positive changes Margaret had brought to their region. Jake's success as a rancher and businessman had attracted attention from agricultural publications and business journals, but he remained uncomfortable with publicity that focused on his unusual inheritance story. He preferred recognition for his innovative farming techniques and community development projects rather than the romantic tragedy that had launched his career. Margaret had taught him that true success was measured by impact on others rather than personal acclaim. The scholarship fund Jake had established in Margaret's name had begun changing lives in ways that would have delighted her. The first recipients were graduating from college and returning to rural communities with skills and knowledge that benefited entire regions. Jake took particular pride in supporting students who, like himself, had grown up thinking higher education was financially impossible. Jake's social circle had expanded to include professionals and intellectuals who shared his interests in sustainable agriculture, rural development, and education reform. These relationships felt natural and reciprocal, unlike the superficial connections he had encountered among purely social wealthy circles. Margaret's influence had given him confidence to engage with ideas and people outside his original experience. Catherine Williams had become Jake's closest confidant, offering perspective on personal and professional decisions without any romantic complications. Their friendship provided emotional support and intellectual stimulation that helped Jake continue growing as a person. Catherine often remarked that Margaret would be proud of the man Jake had become. Using her gifts to benefit others, rather than simply enjoying luxury, Jake had quietly begun dating Sarah Chen, David Chen's daughter, who worked as an environmental lawyer, specializing in agricultural issues. Sarah shared Jake's values about land stewardship and community responsibility, and she had known Margaret well enough to understand the foundation of Jake's character. Their relationship developed slowly and naturally, without the complications of fortune hunting or social climbing that had plagued Jake's other romantic encounters. Sarah appreciated that Jake honored Margaret's memory without being trapped by it. She saw how Margaret's influence had shaped Jake's approach to business, relationships, and community involvement in positive ways. Sarah had no interest in competing with a deceased woman's legacy, but rather in building something new that incorporated lessons learned from that important relationship. The ranch had become a model operation that attracted visitors from around the world interested in sustainable agriculture and rural community development. Jake enjoyed sharing knowledge with other farmers and ranchers, remembering how Margaret had valued education and collaboration over competition. He had established internship programs that brought young people to the ranch to learn practical skills while contributing to operations. Jake's relationship with Margaret's extended family had deepened over time as relatives realized his genuine commitment to honoring her values and continuing her charitable work. Several cousins and nephews had become regular visitors to the ranch, creating family connections that Margaret had never experienced during her lifetime. Jake found satisfaction in providing the family gatherings Margaret had always wanted but never had. Margaret's art collection, which Jake had initially considered selling, had become an important part of the ranch's character. He had built a small gallery space where rotating exhibitions introduced local residents to artwork they might never otherwise encounter. The gallery hosted educational programs,